Hi, it's Midnight Mule, and today I want to talk about the torture stake, which is what the Watchtower teach Jesus died on. It's an interesting subject. They claim to have proof of it. They have evidence. I want to look at that evidence. I'll be looking at this book, Reasoning from the Scriptures. It's what they were using in the 80s, and they have a section on the cross. So the idea of this book is when the Jehovah's Witnesses go door to door, if somebody asks about the cross, why do you teach the torture stake instead of the cross? They've got a page here, I'll be showing it bigger in a minute, here and here, which says reasons, shows evidence, in quotes, why it's the torture stake. The purpose of this video is not to prove or disprove the torture stake or the cross. All I want to do is look at the evidence that the Watchtower provide and to see if it's reasonable and if it holds up at all. So as always, things like this, I need to start with copyright notice saying I'm using copyrighted material. Now, something not all Jehovah's Witnesses may know is they haven't always taught the torture stake. Russell was always teaching the cross, and this picture here is from the book in the 20s, The Harp of God, which was a Rutherford book. And you'll see there's the picture there, which is on the screen. Need to learn how to use the camera, which is Jesus on the cross. And then a bit later in Reconciliation, which has appeared in a previous video of mine, we have Jesus on a T-shaped cross in inverted commas. And they've left a nice big space up here where I guess the sign would hang. That's because some people think it wasn't a standard cross or a torture stake, it was a T-shaped cross. So Rutherford went through a T-shaped phase. And then by the time we got to whatever year this is Paradise Lost. I should have known the year of this. It's going to be 1930 something, I think. 1958, this book. But I think they were teaching it before that. But here's a picture of Jesus on the cross. Sorry, on the torture stake, which I'll bring up here. Now this is a peculiar picture, I think, because the three guys on their torture stakes, they look very casual about it. They're there in their nappies, and if I bring it in a little bit closer, they don't look a little bit distressed or bothered. They're just having a day out in the sun. Now, Jesus doesn't have a beard in this picture because Rutherford thought Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't wear beards, so therefore he went through a phase of drawing Jesus without a beard. And you'll see the two thieves. This must be the thief that repented and said, "Remember me in paradise," because he doesn't have a beard. Whereas this one over here, he must be the bad thief that didn't repent because he has a beard. Anyway, this isn't actually about pictures. This is about the torture stake and their evidence for the torture stake. So I mentioned this book here. I've taken a photo of the pages. I want to look at page 89 and page 90. This is a common book. Some of you may have it at home. Otherwise, I'm sure you better find a copy online somewhere. So the sections in it I want to be looking at. The first paragraph refers to the Imperial Bible, and it talks about the Storos. Now, obviously, as you'd expect, I have the Imperial Bible, so it's very straightforward for me. Here's the section on the cross. I'll be bringing it up a bit bigger on the screen. I can check exactly what they're saying. The Imperial Bible, they're going to talk about Storos, which is the Greek word for torture stake or cross, depending on your viewpoint. That was written in 1874. The next paragraph they look at for their evidence, they're using the Greek English lexicon by Liddell and Scott, and they talk about Cylon, the word for wood or tree, depending on how you view it. That was written in 1843. The first edition was 1843. There were subsequent editions, but we've got no reason to think the text on this changed particularly after that time. Then we're going to look at the non-Christian cross, written in 1896, and that was by J.D. Parsons. There he's looking at the origins of the cross and various other things, but we'll go quite in depth in that one. And then finally the companion Bible, which is from 1885. And based on all that, they then have this sentence, which is what this whole thing is about. Thus, the weight of the evidence indicates that Jesus died on an upright stake and not on the traditional cross. Evidence. So I want to look at this so-called evidence. Now, something curious, this book, as I mentioned, was written in the 80s. I believe I have the 89. I've got the 89 edition. It was written in 85. Why are they referring to things that are like 100 years old? I've got a couple of theories on that, and I'll come to that later. But first, right, thus the weight of the evidence indicates that Jesus died on an upright stake and not on the traditional cross. There was a book, Qualified to be Ministers, which, here we go, here it is, and this could be used. This is all about what things you can and can't say, how you should compose yourself, etc. It's all good advice. 1955 this was written. Just zooming to like doing this sort of things. There's the embossed picture on it. On page 199 of this book, this paragraph, which is paragraph 8, says, "Be very careful to be accurate in all statements you make. Use evidence honestly. In quotations, do not twist the meaning of a writer or speaker, or use only partial quotations to give a different thought than the person intended. Also, if you use statistics, use them properly. Statistics can often be used to give a distorted picture." So they say use evidence honestly. I want to see if we think they've used evidence honestly. They say do not use partial quotations. Let's see if they're guilty of using partial quotations. So this is their own advice, what they should be doing, how they should be treating evidence. So the Imperial Bible Dictionary. Let's have a look at this paragraph. Okay, this is me just zooming in on the paragraph. The Greek word rendered cross in many modern Bible versions, torture stake in New World Translation, is stauros. In classical Greek, this word meant merely an upright stake or pale. Later, it also came to be used for an execution stake having a cross piece. Everything they say there is true. In classical Greek, when you look at stauros, it always seemed to mean an upright stake. Classical Greek, we're talking 300 BC and before. Later, stauros came to be used for an execution stake having a cross piece, which is the cross that we're all familiar with. That is also true. Where they're trying to argue different to other people is they're trying to say at the time of Christ, it still meant a wooden stick, and that's all it meant. And it was after the time of Christ, by whatever period of time, that it then became to mean the cross. Let's see if what they're saying stacks up based on their evidence. So the Imperial Bible Dictionary acknowledges this, saying the Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole or piece of paling on which anything might be hung or which might be used in impaling a piece of ground. ... Even amongst the Romans, the crux, from which our cross is derived, appears to have been originally an upright pole. End of quote. And this was by Fairbairn. He was the main editor in 1874. Now there's a ... here. This is called an ellipsis. And for anyone who's unaware of the exact meaning of this, an ellipsis is a series of dots that usually indicates an intentional omission of a word, sentence or whole section from text without altering its original meaning. So it's important it doesn't alter the meaning, so we need to check if anything this ... is relevant. Also, they end the sentence here, pole. Even amongst the Romans, the crux appears to have been originally an upright pole, full stop. So this is what Jehovah's Witnesses read. They can use this going door to door to prove the cross, to prove the torture stake. So there's a photo of my dictionary. All of that I've highlighted in red is about the cross and a little bit over the page. I had trouble getting a decent image of this. Hopefully you can make that out a little bit. So cross, crucify, this is the part they quote. The Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole or piece of paling on which anything might be hung or which might be used in impaling a piece of ground. but a modification was introduced as the dominion and usages of Rome extended themselves through Greek-speaking countries. That part was changed. They missed it out and had ... 'cause it's not important. And yet it says here, as they extended through Greek-speaking countries, which would have included Israel. There was the modification. The next sentence they quote, even amongst the Romans, the crux appears to have been originally an upright pole, comma. It's not the end of the sentence. What else does it say? And this always remained the more prominent part. But from the time that it began to be used as an instrument of punishment, a transverse piece of wood was commonly added. So it was common, as soon as they started using it for torture or punishment, it was common for there to be a crossbeam. The Watchtower forgot to tell that to their followers. Now it does go on to say, not however always even then, for it would seem that there were more kinds of death than one by the cross. Let's see if this is a defence for them. This being sometimes accomplished by transfixing the criminal with a pole, which was run through his back and spine and came out of his mouth. They've never said that's the way Jesus died. So when it was a single pole, that was one of the ways they might kill someone or torture them and kill them. In another place, Seneca mentions 3 different forms. And he talks about 3 different things. I'll go over it. Seneca mentions 3 different forms. I see, says he, 3 crosses, not indeed of one sort, but fashioned in different ways. One sort suspending by the head persons bent toward the earth, others transfixing them through their secret parts, others extending their arms on a patubulum. There can be no doubt, however, that the latter sort was the more common, and that about the period of the Gospel age crucifixion was usually accomplished by suspending the criminal on a cross piece of wood. Then he goes on to say this doesn't determine the precise form of the cross. So we have the T cross, Andrew's cross, St Andrew's cross as it's called, and then the Latin cross as we're used to seeing it. And then it goes on to say it was on a cross of this form that, according to the general voice of tradition, that our Lord suffered, but there is nothing in the narratives of the evangelists which determined this to have been the form employed rather than either of the other 2. So let's have another look at this minister's book. Use evidence honestly. Do not use only partial quotations. It says to give a different meaning than the person intended. Clearly, the intention of the book, the Imperial Bible Dictionary, when it talks about the cross, is clearly saying it was a cross that Jesus died on. Maybe a bit of slight wriggle room as to the exact shape of the cross. It could have been a T. Cross doesn't seem plausible because there was a sign nailed above his head. That's not possible on the X one, the St Andrew's one. So that is not evidence. There's nothing we've read there in the Imperial Bible Dictionary that is evidence for the torture stake. Okay, what about the next one? The Greek English lexicon. So this paragraph says, was that the case in connection with the execution of God's Son? So the previous paragraph, they think they've argued, look, it was a torture stake, that's what it meant originally. Was that the case with Jesus? Because they've already put that idea in your mind, but we're rejecting that already. But let's say we're running with that for now. It is noteworthy that the Bible also uses the word xylon to identify the device used. A Greek English lexicon by Liddell and Scott defines this as meaning wood cut and ready for use, firewood, timber, etc. Piece of wood, log, beam, post. So this is from the Greek English lexicon saying what xylon can mean. And it's true, I managed to find this online. They are quoting correctly. Wood cut and ready for use, firewood, timber, etc. Piece of wood, log, beam, post. Cudgel, club. They're saying, yep, that's in there as well. Cudgel, club. Stake on which criminals were impaled. Stake on which criminals were impaled. All of those examples are a single piece of wood. So having read those examples, which they're quoting from, we now know that xylon means a single piece of wood, so that then does back up the idea that maybe it's a torture stake when they use the word xylon. Is that why they use that word? But they did have some ... So let's see what words they missed out. Some of the words they missed out. of the Trojan horse, hence anything made of wood. Wooden collar put on the neck of a prisoner. Now imagine a wooden collar that goes on a prisoner would be made from at least 2 pieces of wood. There may be some way of doing it with 1 piece, but I can't picture how that would work. But we'll keep going. Stocks in which the feet were confined. That would definitely be at least 2 pieces of wood. A combination of both with holes for the neck, arms and legs. Definitely more than 1 piece of wood. Gallows. Many pieces of wood to make a gallows. Bench, table, especially money changers table. Front bench in the Athenian theatre. And of live wood tree. Xylon, one of the meanings is tree. We'll come to that in a minute because they do. So they conveniently missed out lots of examples where it's a complex structure made of many pieces of wood, which then goes back to, oh, actually, whenever it uses Xylon, it is perfectly legitimate. It could actually be meaning a cross. But that's not why Xylon was used. Are they being honest with the evidence? Do not use only partial quotations. So I think they're being a bit naughty here. So let's look at the tree business. It also says in New Testament of the cross and cites Acts 5:30 and 10:39 as examples. And then Watchtower go on to say, however, in those verses, the King James Revised Standard, Jerusalem Bible and Derby translate Xylon as tree. Compare this rendering with Galatians 3:13, Deuteronomy 21, 22, 23. So let's look at those. And because they said King James, we can use the King James, but this is taken from their site. Deuteronomy 21, 22, 23. So this is the law effectively given down to Moses. And if a man having committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. And thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, for he that is hanged is accursed of God. But look, he's put to death and then he's hung on the tree. And the fact that he's on a tree is a sign that, look, he's cursed of God. So when Acts are talking about this, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom he slew and then hanged on a tree. The point of this is to point the reader back to Deuteronomy, and the readers of this would have known about Deuteronomy. And so this is showing that Jesus became a curse for us, according to the Bible. That is the point of using the quotation here. Acts 10:39, same thing. And we are witnesses of all things which he did both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Slew and hanged on a tree. Pointing back to Deuteronomy, because he was a curse for us. That was the point of this. Galatians 3:13. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. So it's absolutely legitimate that they're using that word here because they want to point back to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, of course, was written in Hebrew, but the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament they would have had at the time, would have had the word xylon there when they had the word tree. So that's a complete non-argument from the Watchtower there. That's just a bizarre thing to put in, but I'm glad they've put it in because we can then show the reason for it. The reason is, remember, hung on a tree was a curse of God. Now, because we're allowed to use the King James, I want to show you something in Isaiah 33:20. Look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken. There is a Hebrew word that did get translated as stakes, but it was a different Hebrew word that was translated into tree in Deuteronomy. So if in Deuteronomy they wanted to say the word stake, curses the man hung on a stake, which is what the New World Translation said, there was a word the Hebrew could have used for that. And again in Isaiah 54:2, enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitation. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. It's the same word as we used earlier in Isaiah. There was a word the Hebrews used, which we've translated as stakes. Different word we used, translated as tree. In the New Testament, when we talk about Jesus, dying and being hung on the tree, it's to point to Deuteronomy. That's what all that's about. So this second paragraph here, where they're quoting some of the meanings of Xylon, wood, but not all of them, and then bizarrely go off on this irrelevant tangent which doesn't back up their case, does this show any evidence at all for it being a torture stake? In my mind, it really doesn't. And remember, I'm not arguing for or against the cross. I'm just looking at the evidence they present. The Non-Christian's Cross by J.D. Parsons. All right, this was an interesting one to investigate. By the way, the reason I chose this as my next video, I thought, oh, this would be really quick to do. I've got the book, I've got the Imperial Bible Dictionary. Take me 5 minutes to put it together. And I thought, I'll just go through and check these other things in case there's a good argument here for them. And it took ages digging all this up and putting it together. So I hope some of you can like this and appreciate it a bit. So J.D. Parsons, the book The Non-Christian Cross by J.D. Parsons. It's still in print. You can get it as an ebook, or you can get it as a hard copy. It's on Amazon. Lots of different front covers I've seen for this. I managed to find an electronic copy online, so I read that. It's quite interesting. I'll get to the meaning of the book in a bit. But to start with, I want to look at John Denham Parsons. So he was an English writer and Shakespeare authorship theorist. Parsons' book, The Non-Christian Cross, argued that the Christian cross symbol is not Christian in origin. So the thesis of his book, when you read it, is there are many cross symbols. So you're familiar with the normal cross, but there's various crosses with a circle around them. There's the swastika, which the Nazis then inverted. And he gives various examples and shows how these were in existence before the time of Christ. And yet there are various churches, especially the Catholic Church, who use this and venerate this symbol. And he's quite rightly showing these are pagan symbols. Now, when it comes to the Latin cross, the cross that we normally see on a church, he mentions that just in one sentence, and it's a throwaway sentence to say, oh yeah, these other crosses were around before the Latin cross. I have found nothing that shows the Latin cross existed as a symbol before the time of Christ. So when people say the cross was a pagan symbol before Christ, they're not talking about the Latin cross we're used to. They're talking about the other variations of cross, like the swastika, etc., which is not what anyone is suggesting Jesus was crucified on. Anyway, back to Parsons. That's what the point of his book is. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. Parsons authored a 561-page book, The Nature and Purpose of the Universe, on philosophy and psychical research. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower like to officially steer very wide of anything to do with supernatural, apart from what's in the Bible, as in, I suppose, angels and this sort of thing, and the devil. They talk about demons, etc. But you cannot get involved in these sort of things. Now, I'm not in any way saying bad things about the Society for Psychical Research. I'm not saying bad things about John Denham and the fact he was a member of it. I'm merely pointing out he was a member of this Society for Psychical Research. Let's go on a bit more. The SPR, which is the Society for Psychical Research, was the first organisation of its kind in the world, its stated purpose being to approach these varied problems without prejudice or prepossession of any kind, and in the same spirit of exact and unimpassioned inquiry which has enabled science to solve so many problems, once not less obscure nor less hotly debated. So from what I can see, they wanted to examine various supernatural phenomenon and then say if they could debunk it or if it seemed legitimate. So the fact that Parsons was involved in this doesn't mean he was into all this. Maybe he only wanted to debunk it. I don't know that. But he was a member of this society. Areas of study included, and remember this is Parsons, who the Watchtower are quoting to back up their torture stake. Areas of study included hypnotism, dissociation, thought transference, which is telepathy, mediumship, Reichbach phenomena, apparitions and haunted houses, and the physical phenomena associated with seances. These are all things that Jehovah's Witnesses cannot get involved in any of this. And yet somebody who is in this society, who is looking into these things, they're happy to quote. The society still goes today. Maybe some of you are a member of it. I have no idea. Here's an interesting paragraph from their website, from their Our History page. So I just wanted to read this to you. Edmund Gurney died in 1888, Henry Sidgwick in 1900. Shortly after the death of Myers, so these are three of the founding important people, the following year there began a series of automatic writings produced independently by mediums, not in communication with each other, that contained apparently random and meaningless classical allusions. So a medium is somebody, they're a medium between the living and the dead. So they apparently are in contact with the dead. Automatic writing is where they'd hold a pen and they're not controlling their hand. The hand is being controlled and is writing away. Okay, so that's what happened here. And so all this automatic writing was going on by these mediums. The references meant nothing to the mediums, but would have been extremely familiar to the researchers, who were all well versed in classical Greek and Latin literature. Apparently random and meaningless in isolation, the fragments were discovered to interlock meaningfully when the different scripts were collected and compared. The impression was of an organising intelligence, one that could not easily be attributed to the mediums themselves, and which the SPR researchers came to believe was of their deceased colleagues attempting to provide robust proof of their survival. The phenomenon is known as cross-correspondences, and the significance of the writings, which continued for 30 years, is still being debated. This is all an incredibly dodgy area, and this is what Parsons was a member of, and this is the person whose book they are quoting to back up the torture stake. So now let's look on what they're saying about it. The book The Non-Christian Cross by J.D. Parsons says, there is not a single sentence in any of the numerous writings forming the New Testament which, in the original Greek, bears even indirect evidence to the effect that the stauros used in the case of Jesus was other than an ordinary stauros, much less to the effect that it consisted not of one piece of timber but of two pieces nailed together in the form of a cross. That is all true, as in that is exactly what the book does say. Let's carry on. It is not a little misleading upon the part of our teachers to translate the word stauros as cross when rendering the Greek documents to the church into our native tongue, and to support that action by putting cross in our lexicons as the meaning of stauros, without carefully explaining that was at any rate not the primary meaning of the word in the days of the apostles, did not become its primary signification till long afterwards, and became so then, if at all, only because, despite the evidence of corroborative evidence, it was for some reason or other assumed that the particular stauros upon which Jesus was executed had that particular shape. So in the end of the 19th century, there was a bit of a movement among several people who were starting to say, actually, we think it was a torture stake and not a cross. And then a short while after that, that whole idea was debunked. So although he did say this, and at the time some people believed this, it has since been shown that all this is not true. Regarding that it was a torture stake at the time and only later a cross. We now though know that to be not true. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Watchtower used all these quotes from 18 whatever it was. It's because there wasn't anything more recent that supported their case, because it's been thoroughly debunked. Anyway, reading this on its own, you would think Parsons' conclusion is it clearly wasn't a cross. But this just happens to be what they quoted. What Parsons wrote about, remember, was a variety of different crosses and why is it Christians use them as symbols, etc. He wasn't talking about the Latin cross. So I'm going to do some quotes from the same book. But as an explanation of the many different kinds of crosses accepted by us as symbols of the Christ, it only lands us in a greater difficulty. For if we did not know what kind of cross Jesus died upon when we accepted the cross as our symbol, the chances obviously are that we accepted the cross as our symbol for some other reason than we assert. So when you go through and read the book, he's actually quite happy to talk about things like, we do not know what kind of cross Jesus died upon. It's another quote. It is therefore clear that even if we could prove that the instrument of execution to which Jesus was affixed was cross-shaped, he's open to the idea, it would not necessarily follow that it was as the representation of the cause of his death, which we now deem it, that the figure of the cross became our symbol of life and victory. So this part, he's looking at these pagan crosses, these other symbols that we're now saying means life and victory, this, that and the other. And he's saying, how can you get from this cross of Jesus where he died to this state now? But he doesn't have a problem with, okay, it could have been a cross. Another quote from the same book they're using. It is true that a stick may be in the shape of a crutch, and that the straws to which Jesus was affixed may have been in the shape of a cross. Why didn't they use that quote? Why? Our only plausible explanation of the fact that we hold sacred almost any species of cross is that, as we do not know what kind of cross Jesus died upon, opinions have always differed as to which was the real cross. And again, back in the 19th century, toward the end, it was clearly quite fashionable to argue about these things, but it has since been soundly debunked. But just on the quoting, remember, I'm just looking at the quoting of theirs. So the book by J.D. Parsons, which they do accurately quote, does that provide evidence that it was a torture stake? Not for me. It really doesn't. It's not in there. He's not even talking about was it torture stake or cross. He's talking about the pagan symbols, which was not the Latin cross. The Companion Bible. Okay, this is, of the 4 examples they give, this is the only one where when you look at it at face value, it does back up what they say. That is to say, it says Stauros, it meant a stake at a time, and it says about Xylon as well, and it says what they've kind of tried to quote from the other ones saying. This, okay, see also the Companion Bible, there we go, appendix number 162. The chief editor was Bullinger, so he believed that it was a torture stake. He also believed Jesus was crucified with 4 other people, not 2 other people. But the Watchtower didn't mention that. He also believed Jesus died on a Wednesday. The Watchtower don't believe that, and they don't preach that either. He was also a flat earther. The Watchtower don't believe that either. This guy, and there was somebody, and I should have saved off who the person was, but there's another preacher, because Bullinger had lots of what people would call strange ideas, said of his teachings that they were satanic. So Bullinger really isn't a very credible source, and like I said, what he said has since been easily debunked anyway, which is why they have to go these early things. So of all the examples they give, that is possibly the most honest, but at the time of writing it they must have known that it was debunked and was no longer true. And I did find writings at the time that have since been discovered at the times of Christ that shows clearly crucifixions were happening, but I've not brought it in here because it doesn't come from any of their references. But for me, I do not find that satisfactory when you consider the other crazy ideas that Bullinger had. That is still not evidence. So they then go on to say, thus the weight of the evidence indicates that Jesus died on an upright stake and not on the traditional cross. Evidence. Really, I don't see it. I did not see the evidence at all. Now, I don't want you to think I'm being mean and nasty and unfair. Have they said anything about the torture stake where they quote something more modern? Yes, they have. So even though it's outside of this book, let's see if we can get some torture stake evidence from elsewhere. This is from the online library. This is from the Watchtower 2010. It's from the Resist the Pressure of Public Opinion. They've got this paragraph here. If I just zoom in on it. Execution on a torture stake subjected the victim to the worst of all possible indignities. Such an execution was, quote, the penalty for slaves, says scholar Martin Hengel. As such, it symbolized extreme humiliation, shame and torture. So a book by Martin Hengel, or writing by Martin Hengel, it is a book though, should have the quote, the penalty for slaves, as such it symbolized extreme humiliation, shame and torture. And this is all talking about the torture stake. Execution on a torture stake by Martin Hengel. Well, here it is. Here's his book they quoted from. It's called Crucifixion. And I found a copy online electronically. And the first edition was 77. The second printing was 78. And here's the quote. Was the penalty for slaves, as everyone knew. As such, it symbolized extreme humiliation, shame and torture. And that is what they said here. And they attributed that to execution on a torture stake. And he did indeed say those words. So is this finally proof of the torture stake? They've got a credible quote. Well, if we read the whole sentence, what Hengel actually wrote was, death on the cross was the penalty for slaves, as everyone knew. As such, it symbolized extreme humiliation, shame and torture. So they took a book which talked about the cross and talked about death of the cross, missed out the death on the cross part and said, for the torture stake, and put those words in. And for whatever reason, presumably a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses don't actually check these references. They just assume that the information being fed to them is correct. And I do not believe in this example, when they talk about the torture stake, they're using evidence honestly, and they're definitely using partial quotations. So regarding their book and the cross and their evidence, it's just a fail for me. I do not believe what they produce as evidence in any way supports the idea that Jesus died in a torture stake. Remember, I'm not saying he didn't, I'm just saying logically their evidence does not back it up. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about that. I said there were two reasons why I think they used evidence, in quotes, from over 100 years ago. One is because that's when it was fashionable and people thought actually this is possible. So there was a fair bit written about it, but they couldn't have quoted from later because credible sources later never said any of these things because they no longer believed it to be possible. The other reason I think they use early quotes is when the book was written in the 1980s, the Standard Jehovah's Witnesses, even if they did want to research it, would have had great trouble finding these early quotes. So if you can't find them, all you can do is assume that what the Watchtower are telling you really is good information. I hope some of you made it this far. I hope some of you found that interesting and maybe learnt something new there. I'd very much like to see some comments. If you think I've got something wrong, that's fine. Leave it in the comment. Likes and subscribe would be good. I think I might try and do a video every couple of weeks, but I need to see how I do with time. Thank you very much for watching.